Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We're going to be learning today Daf Kuf Chaf Amid Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Yom Tov. We're in the middle of Siman Tov Kuf Vav, and we pick up today near the bottom of Kuf Chaf Amid Aleph in Siman Tov Kuf Vav Siv Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Halash Isa b'Yom Tov. If somebody needs a dough on Yom Tov, somebody wants to make challah on Yom Tov, nice fresh challah for Yom Tov, so he needs a dough. And of course, when you make a dough, you have a chiyuv to be mafresh challah. So the Mechaber says, Halash Isa b'Yom Tov, yachal lahafresh mimena challah. If somebody needs a dough on Yom Tov, he is permitted to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. Now, let's take a look at what's at play here. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Yud Zayin. Yachal lahafresh, he is able to be mafresh challah. Afal gav de ein magbiin trumas b'Yom Tov, even though you're not allowed to be mafresh trumas on Yom Tov. Why not? Mishum denira kemisakein. One problem with being mafresh trumas or other matanos from something on Yom Tov is that you're being misakein what you're being mafresh from, right? You have tevel, you have produce that you're not allowed to consume because you aren't mafresh trumas yet. Now, when you go ahead and you're mafresh truma, you're misakein that tfuah. You fix it and you make it ready for consumption. So that's nireh kemisakein. Now, when we refer to misakein, what's the problem of misakein on Yom Tov? That would be the malacha of makeh b'patish. So if you're being mafresh challah on an isa, in order to render the isa permissible, it's a problem, you would think, of nireh kemisakein. Oy kemagdish. Or alternately, another problem with a potential problem with being mafresh challah is that when you're mafresh matanos like truma, it looks a little bit like hegdish. It looks like you're separating something and giving it over to hegdish. That's usher because it's nireh kemekachu memkar. It looks like you're engaging in commerce. You have property here that's changing hands. So these would be two potential problems with being mafresh challah, but the Mechaber tells me that this is not a problem. You can be mafresh challah on Yom Tov, even though you would think that you might have these two problems. The lush b'Yom Tov, if you need a dough on Yom Tov, loy gazru, the Chazal were not geyser. They did not say that you're not allowed to do this. They permitted it. Va'afilu be'ein lefan of kayin, and this is true even if you don't have a kayin to give the challah to. You see, if you had a kayin to give the challah to, so then you could understand more easily why you should be matir the hafrasha. You're being matir the hafrasha because it's in a way, it's like a tzarich eichel nefesh. You're giving the challah to a kayin who's going to consume it. Still in all, even if you do not have a kayin, or in a locale where even though you have a kayin, still the challah is burned. For instance, us here in Chutz La'aretz, we don't give challah to a kayin to eat. We burn all of our challah. So even if you're not going to give the challah to a kayin for consumption, or even if you're going to burn the challah, still in all, the Chazal said you're allowed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov if you needed the dough on Yom Tov. The reason the Chazal weren't geyser is because since it's absolutely permissible to do the lisha and to need dough on Yom Tov to bake challah, and why is this mutter? Mishum de pas chama odif tvei, because everybody knows that a nice warm challah is definitely much more delicious and is a much greater covered Yom Tov. So therefore, we want you to bake beautiful fresh challahs on Yom Tov. So we're matir the kneading, we're matir the baking, we're matir the making a fire for the baking. All of this we're matir in order for you to be able to bake fresh challahs for Yom Tov. Since all of this is mutter, so that you should be able to have fresh challah for Yom Tov, an intrinsic part of the baking process of baking fresh challah for Yom Tov is that you have to be mafresh challah. So the Chazal were also matir the Hafrashas challah on Yom Tov. So that's the first thing that the Mechaber said here. The Mechaber says if you need a dough on Yom Tov, you are allowed to be mafresh challah. Continues the Mechaber on the bottom line. you're also allowed to transport the challah to the kohen. And like the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, if you have challah that you are able to give to a kohen and you need to transport it through Rishus Harabim, you're allowed to do that act of haitzah in order to bring the challah to the kohen. And the Ramah puts in here in the parentheses, Shari, this is mutter, it's permissible to transport the challah to the kohen, afilu hifrisha me'esmoil, even if you already were mafresh the challah on Erev Yom Tov. So you made a dough on Erev Yom Tov, you baked challah on Erev Yom Tov, and you were mafresh challah on Erev Yom Tov. And now you have the challah, and you want to transport the challah to the kohen, and you want to do haitzah in Rishus Harabim. Says the Ramah, you're allowed to bring the challah to the kohen through Rishus Harabim, even if you already had the challah available to you on Erev Yom Tov. So really, you could have transported the challah to the kohen on Erev Yom Tov. Still in all, you're allowed to do haitzah on Yom Tov in order to bring the challah to the kohen on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in Yud Ches on the bottom line. Afilu hifrisha me'esmoil, you're allowed to bring the challah to the kohen through Rishus Harabim, even if you were mafresh the challah on Erev Yom Tov, so you could have given it to him on Erev Yom Tov. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'lo yamrinan hayaloi lahilicha me'esmoil. We do not say that he should have transported the challah on Erev Yom Tov, and therefore it's not permissible for him to transport it on Yom Tov. And this is true, says the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu tzarech laha'avira derech Rishus Harabim gam ken shari. And it's even mutter to transport the challah to the kohen through Rishus Harabim. So you're doing an actual malacha of haitzah on Yom Tov. Still in all, it's mutter. Why? The haitzah mutter be Yom Tov. Because haitzah, the malacha of haitzah, what we call carrying, is mutter on Yom Tov. Now you'll ask me, wait a second, haitzah is mutter on Yom Tov, but this is a haitzah that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov. So why is that mutter on Yom Tov? We know that we're not matir a haitzah that's completely shaloi l'tzarech. You can't carry outside on Yom Tov something that has no Yom Tov purpose at all. So why are we matir this haitzah of the challah to the kohen if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov? So there's a very nice footnote here in the Dirshu. It's footnote number 16. The Dirshu writes here, Va'af shel inyan meleches oichel nefesh, even though in the context of other malachas that were matir for oichel nefesh, right? Let's say cooking, you're matir cooking for oichel nefesh, but we know that when it comes to malachas that we're matir for oichel nefesh, that you could have done before Yom Tov, and there's no benefit at all to Yom Tov, to doing it on Yom Tov. Mevur b'Ramah el Siman Tov Tzadikei Sif Aleph. We said earlier in Siman Tov Tzadikei she'aser la'asaysa b'Yom Tov. Those types of malachas you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov, even if it's tzarech oichel nefesh, something that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov, and there's no reason at all to do it on Yom Tov. We're not matir, even with tzarech oichel nefesh on Yom Tov. Still, kasav la'el, we said in Siman Tov Tzadikei shaitzah. When it comes to the malacha of haitzah, of carrying, that's mutter on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Why? Because when it comes to the malacha of haitzah, nemar din mitoich shehutra l'tzarech, hutra af shaloi l'tzarech. When it comes to haitzah, we apply the halachic concept of mitoich. And we say, mitoich shehutra haitzah l'tzarech, since the malacha of haitzah is something that we're matir for a tzarech Yom Tov, it's also mutter shaloi l'tzarech. It doesn't mean that it's mutter shaloi l'tzarech klal if there's no tzarech at all, but even if there's a tzarech ktsas, we're matir it on Yom Tov. And over here, there is a little bit of a tzarech. You want to bring the challah to the kohen. You have challah, you want to give it to the kohen, so that's a tzarech. Even though you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, it's mutter on Yom Tov. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here on Kov Chaf Amud Beis. V'dan, you should know, the gam b'Shabbos mutter lo lahilicha l'kohen. On Shabbos, you're also allowed to transport challah to a kohen b'makom sheyesh eruv, as long as there's an eruv, so you're not transgressing the malacha of haitzah. Uba'ofen im haya afo yimei esmail, and as long as we're talking about fully baked challah, we're not talking about a clump of dough We're not talking about your wife separated a clump of dough from her dough, and now that's the challah that you want to bring to the kohen. That you wouldn't be allowed to do. The isa ein reuya lemidi b'Shabbos, because dough is muktzah. Dough has absolutely no use on Shabbos. You're not allowed to bake on Shabbos. So what are you going to do with dough on Shabbos? It's purposeless. Therefore, dough on Shabbos is muktzah. But if you already baked the challah, so you have fully baked challah that you want to bring to the kohen, that you will be allowed to bring it to the kohen on Shabbos as long as there's an erev. As far as the shiloh, if you live in a locale where there is no erev, but you have challah available in the house, and the kohen wants to come to your house in order to eat it on Shabbos, Valechol Shaman is going to eat it in your house. So the issue is, you are giving him challah on Shabbos. Are you allowed to give him challah on Shabbos? Ayin bir halacha, that's discussed over here in a lengthy bir halacha. Okay, now let's turn back to Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph, and let's continue with the words of the Ramah. By me, it's on the bottom line, 2 words before the end of the line on Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph. I'm sorry, not the words of the Ramah, the words of the Mechaber. Continues the Mechaber. So far we said, you're allowed to be mafresh challah from an isa, from a dough that you needed on Yom Tov. Now the Mechaber says, Avol, however, isa shenilusha be'erev Yom Tov, let's say you needed a dough on erev Yom Tov, and now you have the dough sitting in the refrigerator on Yom Tov, and now you take this dough out, and you want to be mafresh challah. Then says the Mechaber, Aser lahafresh mimena challah b'Yom Tov, you're not allowed to be mafresh challah from this dough on Yom Tov, because you should have been mafresh it on erev Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your test. We're talking about a dough shenilusha be'erev Yom Tov, a dough that was kneaded and prepared on erev Yom Tov. Umayri, and explains the Chavetz Chaim, we're discussing over here a dough shegamar kol halisha me erev Yom Tov, where the kneading of the dough was completely accomplished on erev Yom Tov. The kfar is chayiv b'Hafrashas challah, so that this dough is already chayiv in Hafrashas challah. And therefore, the Mechaber says, if you have a dough that was completely kneaded on erev Yom Tov, so that it was already chayiv in challah on erev Yom Tov, so then you should have been mafresh on erev Yom Tov. So then we don't let you be mafresh on Yom Tov. Aval, however, continues the Chavetz Chaim, if you didn't really complete the lisha, you didn't complete the kneading on erev Yom Tov, you combined the flour and the water on erev Yom Tov, but the dough is not yet completely kneaded. Well, in that case, you didn't have a chiyuv of Hafrashas challah yet. The chiyuv of Hafrashas challah first comes when the dough is a completed dough. When you accomplished the kneading in its completion, then the dough is chayiv in challah. But before that point, it's not chayiv in challah. So then, if you didn't knead it enough on erev Yom Tov, and you still have to finish the kneading on Yom Tov, if so, may erev Yom Tov lein is chayiv adayin b'challah. Then on erev Yom Tov, the dough was not yet chayiv in challah. In that case, how could you be mafresh on erev Yom Tov? It wasn't chayiv yet. So it only becomes chayiv and challah on Yom Tov when you complete the kneading. So in that case, that dough would be treated the same way as a dough that you first kneaded on Yom Tov, because it's not chayiv and challah until Yom Tov, and then you would be allowed to be mafresh it on Yom Tov. But in this case, where you completed the kneading on erev Yom Tov, then the Mechaber said, Aser lahafresh mimena challah b'Yom Tov, then it is forbidden to be mafresh challah from this dough on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut l'chaf, Aser lahafresh. Why is it forbidden to be mafresh challah from this dough? Dein magbiin trumas amaisres b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov heichi detfili me'esmal. Because you're not allowed to be mafresh trumas, maisres, or other matanos like challah on Shabbos or Yom Tov when the chiyuv already existed before Yom Tov. If the chiyuv existed before Yom Tov, you should have done your hafrasha before Yom Tov. You didn't. We're not going to now allow you to do it on Yom Tov. The chanal, the sif cotton yud zayin, like we discussed previously in Mishnah Berurah, sif cotton yud zayin. V'chein, and similarly, says the Chavetz Chaim, b'haya afui me esmail, if you already baked your challah yesterday, da'asa lahafresh hayom, you can't do a hafrasha today. Va'afilu b'chalas chutz la'aretz hadin came. And this din, that you're not allowed to be mafresh the challah from something that was already chayiv in challah before Yom Tov, so now you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov, that din applies even on chalas chutz la'aretz. What's the chiddush over here? The chiddush is, I told you at the beginning of this year, that the problem with being mafresh challah is nireh kemisaken. It looks like you're doing makeh b'patish. You had a dough that's not ready for consumption because you aren't mafresh challah yet. Now by being mafresh challah, you're preparing the dough for consumption. That's like a makeh b'patish type problem. But that's not so true when it comes to chalas chutz la'aretz. Because chalas chutz la'aretz, according to some, the chiyuv is only a chiyuv d'Rabbanan. So are you really nireh kemisaken? If you're talking about chalas Eretz Yisrael, where there's an issa daraisa, where midaraisa you have to be mafresh the challah, and you're not allowed to consume anything from that issa, there would be an issa daraisa before the Hafrashas challah. So then you have a bona fide problem of nireh kemisaken. But by chalas chutz la'aretz, where the whole Hafrasha is only d'Rabbanan according to many, and according to many, you're even allowed to, we're going to see, you're allowed to eat from the dough even without being mafresh challah. What you could do is you could eat from the dough and leave some over, and then tomorrow after Yom Tov you'll be mafresh. So is it really a problem of nireh kemisaken? You might think it's not so much nireh kemisaken, and maybe you're allowed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Va'afilu b'chalas chutz la'aretz hadin came. This din that you're not allowed to be mafresh the challah on a dough that was already chayiv before Yom Tov, that applies even on chalas chutz la'aretz. Va'afilu lo'hifresh mach mashikcha nami also lo'la'afrisha. And even if you're sort of an oinus, even if you simply forgot to be mafresh before Yom Tov. So it's not that I intentionally wasn't mafresh before Yom Tov and I waited to Yom Tov to be mafresh. Then I can understand. Maybe you want to cancel me, you want to penalize me, and you want to say that since I intentionally waited for Yom Tov, you're not allowed to be mafresh. But over here, I forgot. It was an accident. I forgot. Still in all, you're not allowed to be mafresh. V'im avar v'hifresh, and if you transgress this halacha and you were mafresh challah on Yom Tov, from something that was already nischayev b'challah before Yom Tov, says the Chavetz Chaim, im b'mezid, if you did this b'mezid, aser loyvel acherim ad motzai Shabbos, then this dough, this pas, this bread is aser to you, to the owner, and to everybody else until after Shabbos. Then b'shoigig, and if it was b'shoigig, you went ahead and you were mafresh by accident, inadvertently, you didn't realize it was aser, then mutter miyad, then it's mutter right away. Okay, so now the Mechaber has told us, if you needed a dough on Yom Tov, you're allowed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. If you needed a dough before Yom Tov, so the dough was already nischayev b'challah before Yom Tov, then you're not allowed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. So what should you do? I needed a dough on Erev Yom Tov. It was chayev b'challah on Erev Yom Tov. I wasn't mafresh. Now it's Yom Tov. I want to eat this bread. I want to eat this challah on Yom Tov. But I wasn't mafresh challah yet, and you're telling me I'm not allowed to be mafresh challah. So is there an eitzah? Is there something I can do so that I should be able to enjoy these beautiful hot challahs on Yom Tov? So says the Ramah, Haga, what should you do? Ela oichel, what you could do is you could eat the challah before your mafresh challah, umishayer ktsas, and leave over some of the challah. Don't consume all of the challah. Ulamachar, and then tomorrow after Yom Tov, mafresh min hamushuyer challah, you'll be mafresh challah from the amount that you left over. So you made a batch of challah and you made 10 challahs. Now it's you aren't mafresh challah yet, and you made these challahs on Erev Yom Tov. So now on Yom Tov, the Mechaber said you're not allowed to be mafresh challah. So now I have 10 challahs on Yom Tov, and I wasn't mafresh challah from them. What could I do? Says the Ramah. You could eat 8 challahs, consume 8 challahs, leave over 2 challahs, and then after Yom Tov, you'll go to those 2 challahs, you'll break off some, and you'll be mafresh challah on what's left and on what you already consumed. You'll be mafresh after challah, and you'll be mafresh after Yom Tov. And you're allowed to eat this challah on Yom Tov, even though you weren't mafresh challah yet, on the smach that you're going to be mafresh after challah. That's what the Ramah says here. You could consume your challah and leave over some. And tomorrow, after Yom Tov, mafresh min hamashuyur challah, you'll be mafresh from the leftovers. You'll be mafresh challah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chaf Aleph. Ella oichel, you're allowed to eat from the challah that you baked before Hafrashas challah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hainu l'didon b'chutz la'aretz t'chiyuva eina min ha'torah. That's only true by us in chutz la'aretz, where chalas chutz la'aretz is only a din d'Rabbanan. Well, the chalas Eretz Yisrael, if you would be dealing in Eretz Yisrael, where it's a din d'Oraisa, like a takana, there's no way for you to eat this challah. You're not allowed to eat challah if you weren't mafresh challah from it yet. You can't eat a pasta you weren't mafresh challah from yet in Eretz Yisrael. That would be in Issa d'Oraisa. So you have no takana because you can't eat it before the hafrasha, relying on the hafrasha that you're going to do after Yom Tov. Ella, except, says the Mishnah Berurah, Elim came yolish oid isa v'chibesayf hasif. There is a kunst that we're going to see tomorrow, which is that you could knead another dough now on Yom Tov, and if you knead a dough on Yom Tov, you're allowed to be mafresh challah. So knead another dough now on Yom Tov, be mafresh challah from that dough, and be mafresh enough and say that you're being mafresh on the dough that you needed now and on the dough that you needed before Yom Tov. That would be the only takana. The Ramah said what you could do is you could eat from the challah, leave over some, leave over some. How much do you have to leave over? Says the Chavetz Chaim, you have to leave over more challah than the amount that you have to be mafresh. So let's make up numbers for argument's sake. Let's say you made a batch of challah, you made it on Erev Yom Tov, it was chayav the challah on Erev Yom Tov, you weren't mafresh challah, now it's Yom Tov, you want to bake this bread and you want to eat it, and you say, oy vey, I wasn't mafresh challah. So the Ramah said, what you could do is, you could bake the challah, you could eat from the challah, and you could leave over a certain amount, and then be mafresh from that. How much do you have to leave over? So let's say you're going to have to be mafresh 5 ounces. 5 ounces of dough. Could you leave over just 5 ounces of dough? No, that you can't do. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what do you have to do? If you're going to want to be mafresh 5 ounces of challah, you have to leave over, let's say, 8 ounces of challah to Erev Yom Tov. You can't leave over exactly 5 ounces. Why? So there's 2 reasons. First of all, Kidei sheyafresh challah me oisai hashir, whatever you're going to leave over to Erev Yom Tov to be mafresh from, you need to leave over an amount that you could then be mafresh challah from it and still have leftovers. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, the ba'inan sheyihi yashiyareha nikar. The halacha is that when you're mafresh challah, it has to be clear that you took off some and left over some that you're being misake. So you can't, if you need 5 ounces for challah, you can't consume all the challah and just leave over 5 ounces. And then after Yom Tov, take those 5 ounces and say, Harezu challah. Because what are you separating it from? You're not separating it from anything. You're not leaving anything over. So if you have to be mafresh 5 ounces, you have to leave over, let's say, at least 8 ounces. That way you're mafresh 5 ounces, and you see, I separated the 5 from the 8. And look, there's 3 left over. So that's called a hafrasha. Otherwise, you don't have a hafrasha. And there's another reason, says the Chavetz Chaim. And furthermore, again, let's say you needed 5 ounces of challah for your hafrashas challah. If you consume everything else and just leave over 5 ounces, dami command mafresh b'yom tov. Then in essence, you were mafresh your challah on Yom Tov. You weren't mafresh your challah by taking 5 ounces and saying harezu challah and leaving the rest. What you did was you ate the rest, and now only 5 ounces are left. So it's like a reverse hafrasha. But in essence, you are mafresh on Yom Tov, which you're not allowed to do. Ice cut and chav gimel. So you leave some over. Ulamachar mafresh, and then tomorrow after Yom Tov you're mafresh challah. Chavetz Chaim brings down an interesting case. He says, "Ube'erev Pesach shechal liyos b'Shabbos." Let's say Erev Pesach falls out on a Shabbos. Sha'af alechem chametz al Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos, your wife went ahead and baked challah. You want to have beautiful, nice, fresh chametz stick of challahs for Shabbos. Just because Shabbos is Erev Yom Tov, Shabbos should lose out and not have challah? No. So you baked challah on Erev Shabbos, and now you have this beautiful chametz on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach. And you realize, I wasn't mafresh challah. What do you do now? You can't do the trick that we just said. What are you going to do? Eat the challah on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach, and leave over some of it until after the first day's Yom Tov to be mafresh challah? You can't do that. It's chametz. You can't hold on to chametz over Pesach. So this trick doesn't work. So in this case, if you weren't mafresh challah on Erev Shabbos, hiskimu kama achronim, many of the achronim agree there's some chinon b'diavad, that in this kind of a b'diavadik case, we rely ahani paiskim on the paiskim that hold the bechalas chutz la'aretz shari lahafresh afilu b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov. We have these shittas that hold that, like I said earlier, that Hafrashas challah on chalas chutz la'aretz doesn't have so much of a problem of nirek kemisakein, because, like we're seeing, really you're allowed to eat challah, you're allowed to eat pas in chutz la'aretz that you weren't mafresh from before the hafrasha, as long as you're going to be mafresh later. So how much of a problem is there of nirek kemisakein when you're mafresh challah? Are you really being misakin it? It's not that it was aser ba'achila before and it's mutter ba'achila now. There's a kunz where it was even mutter ba'achila before the hafrasha. So you don't have such a nirek kemisakin problem. And therefore, there are shittas that hold that on chalas chutz la'aretz, you're allowed to be mafresh challah on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So in this case, when Erev Pesach fell out on a Shabbos and you're stuck, you can't eat the challah on Shabbos relying that you're going to be mafresh, that you're going to leave over some and be mafresh from those leftovers after Shabbos, because that's Pesach and you're not allowed to maintain the chametz on Pesach. So what do? You rely on these paiskim, v'yafresh, so you'll be mafresh the challah on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach. Now, what do you do with it? The challah that you're mafresh is also chametz. What do you do with this chametz? V'yitinenu l'kayin cotton pachas b'teisha. You could give it to a kayin, a minor kayin, a kayin cotton who's less than 9 years old. So he never experienced tuma hayotze migufay. He never became a balkari. He never became a zav, and therefore it's possible that it's still permitted for him to eat chalas chutz la'aretz. Afilu legadol shetaval, or even to a kayin who's a gadol who went to the mikveh. Even though there are those that hold that even chalas chutz la'aretz you're not allowed to be mafresh for on Shabbos, and therefore it would seem that there is no takana to eat this challah, even though you have those shittas. Nevertheless, in a pressing circumstance, where you don't have any other bread for this Shabbos. The only challah that you have for Shabbos is this challah that your wife baked on Erev Shabbos, Erev Pesach, and you aren't mafresh challah on, yesh lismach lahakil. In such a case, we could rely on these other shittas and we could rule leniently. Okay. Continues the Ramah, by me it's on the bottom line of Kuf Chaf Amud Beis, and the Ramah throws in another halacha here. So he says, again, if you needed a dough on Erev Yom Tov, and it was chayiv and challah on Erev Yom Tov, and therefore there's really no heter for you to be mafresh challah from it on Yom Tov. So the eitz of the Ramah was, what you could do is, you could still bake this dough on Yom Tov, and you could eat from it on Yom Tov, as long as you leave over some to after Yom Tov, and you'll be mafresh challah from that Erev Yom Tov. Okay, says the Ramah now, umuter lefais hapas, you're allowed to bake this bread. So you have this dough on Yom Tov, and in this dough, there's challah. Are you allowed to bake it? After all, the challah portion of the dough is not tzarich nefesh. Nobody's going to eat it. We don't give challah to a kayin nowadays. So no one's going to eat this final baked product. It's going to get burned eventually. So are you allowed to bake it on Yom Tov? That's not tzarich nefesh. Says the Ramah, yes, you are allowed to. Umuter lefais hapas, you're allowed to bake the bread al yedei sheyochal mimenu, since it's a tzarich nefesh, because people are going to eat it. The yafresh acher kach challah, and then you'll be mafresh challah from this dough after Yom Tov, from what remains. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton chav dalid. You're allowed to bake this bread even though it has a portion in it which is challah, which is not going to be eaten on Yom Tov. Even though the baking process that you're doing now on Yom Tov is something that you're doing for the part of the dough which is ultimately going to be challah, so it's not tzarich nefesh, it's not going to get eaten. The chelik zeh lo yeyechol b'Yom Tov. So how are you allowed to bake it on Yom Tov if it's not being eaten on Yom Tov? And we're going to see a similar case later on in Sivav. We're going to say that it's aser. Shani hacha over here, it's different. Over here, what are we going to do? We can't tell you bake the rest of the dough, but don't bake the challah portion of the dough. You're not allowed to separate it because that would constitute Hafrashas challah, and you're not allowed to do Hafrashas challah on Yom Tov. And furthermore, continues the Mishnah Berurah, shechelik hachallah bezman hazeh hu davar mu'at. Bezman hazeh, the in Chutz La'aretz, the amount of dough that was separating for challah is very much a davar mu'at. It's a very insignificant amount. And you're not doing any more tircha. You're not doing anything greater because of that amount of the dough that's challah. However, there are those who rule stringently here. And they say that since you needed this dough before Yom Tov, yesterday before Yom Tov, and yesterday before Yom Tov, you were able to be mafresh challah, so you could have separated out the challah portion. Therefore, so then, according to these sheets, you're not allowed to bake the entire dough on Yom Tov. Because of this problem, because you have part of the dough that's destined to become challah that's not called eichel nefesh. The Mishnah Berurah says that lechatchila we should be concerned with this opinion. Shaloi lefa is kala isa, and therefore we should not bake the entire dough. Varak sheyasher k'tzas isa shaloi lefa ad achar Yom Tov. We should make sure to leave some over and not bake it until after Yom Tov. But if you transgress this halacha and you did bake the entire dough, certainly you're allowed to eat it. And we will stop over here at the in the Mishnah Berurah. And we're up to the beginning of Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph, where the words of the Ramah continue. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for Liban HaTorah. The schus of Liban HaTorah should say God's Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs and Parnasa to everyone. And we should all be zeichet together to see the Bias Girl Tzedek, the Meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.